Hello, everyone. It is the morning after a Browns loss to the Buffalo Bills, 26-10. As ugly a game with playoff implications as you will see from both teams. At one point, Chris, I said that this game was the exact opposite of Tom Brady versus Aaron Rodgers. As Brian Hoyer, Kyle Orton put on a battle for the ages. Both offenses struggled. Both defenses actually played fairly well. The Browns kind of collapsed there towards the end. And, of course, the big story, Johnny Manziel makes his first significant appearance and leads the team on an 80-yard scoring drive, capped by a 10-yard touchdown run in the fourth quarter. So here we are. It's that time again in Cleveland where we're talking about quarterbacks. But I want to start here because this has been coming for a little while. This isn't a big surprise that Johnny Manziel finally found the field. And one of the things I've been thinking about is how Mike Pettin has handled this quarterback situation, going back to training camp and preseason and now the regular season. And maybe aside from Johnny Manziel never getting to actually start a preseason game, I actually feel like Mike Pettin has handled this quarterback situation pretty well. Brian Hoyer gave you the best chance to win at the beginning of the season. That's kind of played out. We've seen that. And now we see Johnny Manziel.
Right, but what did we say about Brian Hoyer? What did a lot of people say about Brian Hoyer? What did the coaching staff say about Brian Hoyer at the beginning of the year? You know, he might not be great. We understand that. He's not going to put up the big, gaudy numbers. We're not going to score 30 points per game. But we've got a steady guy, a guy that we know is not going to throw the game away, a guy that we know is not going to give the game to the other team. In the month of November, Brian Hoyer has started giving games to the other team. The only reason Atlanta was even in the game last week, Dan, was because Brian Hoyer let them be in the game. The only reason that Buffalo's offense was doing anything against the Browns' defense at one point is because Brian Hoyer continued, and the offense in general, continued to give Buffalo a short field to work on. So when you have a quarterback who was supposed to just manage the game, not make the big mistakes, start making those big mistakes, then it's time to go with a guy who's going to give you more of a chance to move the ball effectively on offense.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of go back and kind of look for his last really good game.
Find it.
It's hard to find one.
It.
And, I mean, I'm looking at numbers in front of me, but to me, with Hoyer, the numbers haven't always told the story. I mean, you look at that game again in Atlanta, he threw for 322 yards, but that was not a good performance.
One drive.
Exactly.
You can't point to that game.
Even the Cincinnati game, where they won big over Cincinnati, that really wasn't really Brian Hoyer. He made a couple of throws, but it wasn't really Brian Hoyer. So I think we've just reached that point where the string is out on this guy. You've gotten everything you can out of him. We talked about it last week. You've seen what Brian Hoyer is. He's a capable backup. He's a guy that if you need somebody to come in and run your offense for a few weeks and not completely lose you games when your starter's out, I think you can trust Brian Hoyer in that situation. Well, we know for sure, and I'm sorry, Joe Linta, Brian Hoyer is not a $100 million quarterback. He's a backup.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the reason that he is a backup to me, Dan, is because the more you see the guy play, the more you see the flaws. And the more the opposing defense sees the flaws. And I think that's the most important thing. As the season has gone on, Brian Hoyer has gotten worse. The team around him hasn't gotten worse. The offensive line hasn't gotten worse. The running game hasn't gotten worse.
I would say the offensive line has gotten worse just because you lost Alex Mack. You're down to your third-string center. So I will say the offensive line, you can make the case, isn't the same offensive line he started the year with.
Dan, 21 quarterbacks in the NFL have been sacked more than Brian Hoyer.
I'm not saying that as an excuse. I'm just saying you can make the case for the receiving core and everything else, but the offensive line is not the same offensive line. And that's where Brian Hoyer's flaws come through because every time he faces pressure, that's when he struggles.
But even when he doesn't face pressure, he was starting to struggle. And I think the reason for that, Dan, is because there's a blueprint on how to slow him down, how to take away what it is that he wants to do. As a Browns fan, we went into these games saying, all right, if Brian Hoyer has a running game, and if Brian Hoyer has protection, and if the defense plays well, the Browns can win the game. You don't want to say that going into every single game. I went in that game yesterday against Buffalo, picking Buffalo, because I said, they will take away all the things that Brian Hoyer needs in order for him to win football games. It shouldn't be that way. I mean, how many times in the NFL, Dan, can you ask your starting quarterback, and you ask the defense and the running game and the wide receivers and the special teams, how many times can you ask all of those units to bail out your starting quarterback?
Yeah. Well, and you can't. It's not fair to them. At some point, your quarterback has to be able to make plays to win you games.
That's right.
Going back to that pressure thing, and this is one of the reasons that I picked the Bills. When you look at who the Browns have beaten, they've beaten one team in the top half of the league in sacks, Tennessee, and they needed a miracle for that.
Yep.
So it's been all about pressure, and like you said, even when he hasn't faced pressure, Brian Hoyer has struggled. But especially when when he gets moved off his spot, when the timing of his routes gets disrupted. You've got to run certain routes with small receivers, and if Brian Hoyer doesn't have time to see those routes develop, he just can't do the things that a starting quarterback needs to do to overcome some deficiencies.
Browns fans were hoping, and the Browns internally, Dan, they were hoping that he was going to progress. Instead, he's regressed. In the month of November, the last 4 games, he's got 1 touchdown and 6 interceptions. He's completing 53% of his passes. And I think, again, that's because there's a blueprint out there. Because opposing defense, they understand what are his strengths, what are his weaknesses, how can we exploit those weaknesses. And Brian Hoyer himself never made the adjustment to those things. And I think part of the reason why he didn't make the adjustment, Dan, is because he's got nowhere to turn.
Yeah.
What's he going to do? What's he going to pull from himself? He's got nothing to pull from himself. Whereas Johnny Manziel, to me, there isn't a blueprint. There's a little bit of the unknown. There's a little bit of the defense being off balance. And if they start to take away some of the things that Johnny Manziel does well, I think there's still more that he can grab from within.
Yeah, and I don't know what we're going to see out of Johnny Manziel. I'm not sold on Johnny Manziel as the answer for this team, but I think, Mike Pettin, immediately after the game, and you expected this, he didn't want to name a starting quarterback. He also didn't throw his support behind Brian Hoyer either, which says a lot. And then, of course, he had the interview with Sal Paolantonio that kind of indicated he was leaning towards Johnny Manziel a little bit, if you want to read between the lines. I think you've got to go with Johnny Manziel against Indianapolis. I think if you put Brian Hoyer out there, for a lot of reasons, but if you put Brian Hoyer out there and he starts 0 for 3, what's that stadium going to sound like?
Right.
All the air comes out of that stadium. I understand you're playing Indianapolis and they have a great offense and they're a good football team, but I think you got to put Johnny out there. You've kind of opened that door. It's going to be awfully tough to just slam it shut.
Dan, I thought it was very, very telling how the team responded to Johnny Manziel going into the game.
Yeah.
And I felt like that ignited the entire offense. I felt to the point of Johnny Manziel coming into the game that the offense was dead. The offense was lifeless, and that's because of Brian Hoyer. And that was very, very deflating yesterday to see Brian Hoyer turn the ball over again and again and again, to call on the defense to slow down Kyle Orton again and again and again. And I thought when Johnny Manziel went in there, the Browns were like, okay, we don't have to work as hard as a unit. We've got somebody who can give us energy, somebody that can try and rally this team. Now, he didn't. They still lost the game. They still are 7-5, but I thought the response of all the players around Johnny Manziel was very, very telling. And I looked at it very similar to the Denver Broncos situation a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
When Kyle Orton was struggling and that offense was dead. Yeah. What do you know? And by the way, you saw 2 quarterbacks that were like the same guy. Brian Hoyer, if he could have hair, he would be Kyle Orton. That's the comparison. He does the same kinds of things. He needs the same kinds of things. But if you remember, Denver made the switch from Kyle Orton to Tim Tebow. And it just energized the entire fan base. And it, more importantly, energized the entire sidelines.
Yeah.
And I thought Johnny Manziel had that kind of energy yesterday.
That being said, though, obviously we're going to talk about Brian Hoyer. We're going to talk about Johnny Manziel. But there were a lot of people that played a role in this loss yesterday. And you look at Joe Thomas, played one of his worst games as a pro. Right. Josh Gordon couldn't be more polar opposite than what we saw against Atlanta. I mean, the effort was questionable. There were clear miscommunications between he and Brian Hoyer, especially on that first interception. I don't know if he was going one way, Brian Hoyer was throwing the other way. I don't know what happened on that play. But there were a lot of things that went wrong yesterday. And we're going to talk about the quarterbacks. We're going to point at Brian Hoyer. We're going to talk about Johnny Manziel. But there were deeper issues. There were bigger things that aren't as easy of fixes as just switching a quarterback. You're down to your third string center now. And we'll find out what happens with Nick McDonald, if he's able to go this week or not, but you might be down to your third string center. Like I said, Josh Gordon, come on. You've got to put forth a better effort than that. He looked like a guy that missed 10 games. There were a lot of different. The running game. Yeah, I know Buffalo's a really, really good run defense.
That's right.
One of the top run defenses in the NFL, but Isaiah Crowell's got to find a way to do better than 1.9 yards a carry.
You're right. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Johnny Manziel is going to be the magic elixir, but I think having him out there, Dan, I think that's going to make things easier for these guys. Because now all of a sudden the defense is like, oh boy, there's a different dimension there with the offense. And if you are on your third string center, what's a way to combat pressure? Have a guy who's mobile enough to make some plays, extend plays, move the pocket. If you don't have a great running game, what's a way to combat that? Have a quarterback who can be an extension of that running game, a guy who can pick up yards by himself, a guy who makes the defense think, okay, is he going to hand the ball off or is he going to take off himself? Those are kinds of issues. Again, he's not the magic elixir, but those are kinds of issues that I think Johnny Manziel can help you with. So if you do need that lift offensively, and there are some weaknesses on this offensive line and in the running game, he's a guy that can help you in those areas, I think.
And the other thing, too, is we talked about Brian Hoyer kind of maximizing what he's got to this point. We've kind of seen the top. And I think this football team in general, you're kind of to that point now where you've seen they've maximized what they have. They have overachieved to epic proportions. They are in a playoff. They are playing another playoff caliber game on Sunday in December.
That's right.
That's enormous. That's a big step forward. But they're overachieving, and we're seeing that luck, whatever you want to call it, start to run out with the loss to Houston, needing a last-second field goal and a miraculous drive and some bad coaching decisions to beat Atlanta. Yesterday against Buffalo. You're starting to see things fall apart a little bit. You got to get through 4 games. And if Johnny Manziel can give you enough of a spark to maybe find some of that magic you had earlier in the season, I guess you have to try it. I know it feels like you're grasping at straws, but there's no good reason right now in my mind that you would go back to Brian Hoyer next week.
It's funny because you bring that all up, and if you were to ask yourself, okay, what's the Browns' identity as they were through 11 games and they were 7-4, you'd be scrambling to look for an answer. And a lot of people would say, well, they just find a way to win. And sometimes it's ugly, but they find a way by any means necessary. Dude, that's not an identity.
No.
A lot of that is luck. A lot of that is the opponents that you're playing against. So you had to ask yourself, okay, when Brian Hoyer doesn't have those game-winning drives, when the defense doesn't come up and make a play to get the ball back in his hands, what's going to happen? You can't live and build your foundation on just finding a way. That's not an identity in the NFL at all.
That can get you through a few weeks.
Yeah.
That might even be able to get you through a season.
Right.
That's not a long-term plan.
No.
Your identity, like you said, can't be, we just find a way to win. And look, the schedule's been bad this year.
Yeah.
That's been a big break for the Browns. Now, you play who you play, and you take advantage of who you take advantage of. I don't blame the Browns for beating Tampa Bay and Oakland and some of these other teams, Atlanta, these other teams they've beaten. I don't blame them for that. Good for them. We've seen Browns teams lose those games before. But you do have to look at it objectively and think, okay, is this team for real? What is the best move forward for this team? Not just the rest of this year for 4 games, trying to get to the playoffs, but next year, because you can't have a season like this year and then go 4-12 next year.
Yeah.
You have to keep it going.
And I just get the sense that in Berea, Dan, they feel like they've seen all they've needed to see with Brian Hoyer. I think now they have a good gauge on who he is, and not only does this give the Browns, making a switch to Manziel, not only does this give the Browns a chance to maybe win a game against Indianapolis or Cincinnati or something like that, whatever the case may be, the schedule gets tougher from here on out.
Yeah.
But it also gives the Browns a chance to evaluate Johnny Manziel and see what they have. And I think at the beginning of the season, if the Browns would have made a list of things that they wanted to accomplish this year in what was looked at as kind of like a rebuilding year, it's the first year of Mike Pettin trying to implement the culture and change some other things around this organization. I think if they were honest with themselves and honest with us, and they were making a list of things they wanted to accomplish, I would say near the top of that list was getting some kind of evaluation of a guy like Johnny Manziel. because I think they want to know what they have with him, and they're not going to have a full picture here in the final stretch of this season if they do go with Johnny Manziel. But they're going to have a better picture of what they have with him as they head into the offseason.
What kills you about yesterday's loss is, one, you're now tied with the Bills, except the Bills have the head-to-head tiebreaker. The Steelers lost yesterday.
Yep.
The Ravens lost yesterday. Of course, they lost to the Chargers, who's one of those teams that you're chasing. But you had an opportunity. If you win that game on Sunday, you would have been able to pass the Steelers. You would have been able to pass the Ravens. You've still got a game in hand against the Bengals. You still have a game in hand against the Ravens. And now you're a team that has almost no tiebreakers. You're mixed in with a bunch of 7-5 teams. It really hurt to lose that game yesterday, and it makes this Indianapolis game. And this is not the situation you wanted. You didn't want this Indianapolis game to be a must-win.
Yeah.
But it is now.
Yeah, and the other thing that was deflating to me, Dan, is that Buffalo didn't even play all that well.
No, they were off. There were moments in that first half where I felt like, oh, okay, I'm wrong. The Browns are going to win this game, but they just never were able to capitalize.
Right, and it just goes back. How deflating is it to the defense that they come up with this big-time turnover, they give the Browns the ball in great field position, and then you see Brian Hoyer lead a field goal attempt drive? That's deflating to the defense.
And then see Billy Cundiff shank a field goal.
30-yarder.
The Browns have a kicking issue.
What in the world was that, Dan?
I think it's safe to say that the Browns have a kicking issue.
Yeah, like if you lose to Houston because J.J. Watt plays out of his mind and because Alfred Blue runs all over you and he has like career day, something along those lines, you know, sometimes you can live with those things. Baltimore. You lost against Baltimore early on in the year because Steve Smith came up and he made a big-time play in a big-time moment, and Joe Flacco made a big-time throw in a big-time moment. Sometimes you can live with those things, but you can't live with Buffalo playing probably their C game, maybe their D game. They got no pressure on Brian Hoyer at all in the first half. Their defense was very, very leaky, I thought, in the first half. They don't even play that well, and they beat you by 16.
Yeah, the Browns had their short passing game kind of going early in that game. They were getting good underneath routes. They were finding Josh Gordon underneath, and they were doing the things they needed to do to counteract Buffalo, but they just could not capitalize. And when is the last time this team has made anyone pay for a turnover? For as many turnovers as this team has forced, they just don't make people pay for that.
Right. The only time that I can think of that the Browns made a team pay recently for a blunder that team made was last week against Atlanta when Mike Smith made a coaching blunder. But aside from that, again, it goes back to what you said. When it comes to Brian Hoyer, find me the last time he played well. Because I can't.
It's tough. I mean,
what do you got?
You can't just look at the numbers. You got to look at the game itself.
Yeah. Are you going to say Atlanta? You can't say Atlanta.
No, obviously not.
You can't say Houston.
Nope.
You can't say Cincinnati.
Probably not. No.
Are you going to say Tampa Bay?
I guess.
Really?
I don't know. I mean, what's the baseline for playing well? I guess. You know, this is a guy who, again, like you've said, the more he plays, the more he's going to get exposed.
That's right.
And he started those 3 games last year, and then this year he comes out, starts the season as your starting quarterback. He's finally kind of been exposed. We know who Brian Hoyer is, and now we've got to find out who Johnny Manziel is.
You know what's hilarious to me? To some degree, so many fans have been waiting and looking forward to the return of Josh Gordon, right? We've all been looking forward to Josh Gordon returning. Now we're going to sit here and say that he's part of the problem? Like, yeah, we got Josh Gordon back. Awesome. Well, no, Josh Gordon's hurting Brian Hoyer. Like, really? Seriously? Is that what we're going to do now? We've been waiting all this time for Josh Gordon to come back, and now we're going to say that he's hurting Brian Hoyer?
Yeah, I think if you want to say yesterday, if you want to look at yesterday's game and you want to say that Josh Gordon needs to do better, that's fine. But if you're pointing the finger at Josh Gordon and blaming him for Brian Hoyer's struggles, it's not accurate. Right. But we do need to see a better Josh Gordon against the Colts on Sunday. And all right, we got to do game balls. I don't even know who to give a game ball to.
Well, you mentioned it. You can't give it to Joe Thomas.
No.
Joe was bad yesterday. You can't give it to Josh Gordon.
No. Hawk didn't really even do anything.
Certainly can't.
Neither of the running backs did anything.
Can't give it to Billy Cundiff.
Do you give it to Johnny Manziel for 1 touchdown drive?
Sure.
Just because yesterday was so awful offensively that 1 touchdown drive gets a game ball?
It was the only touchdown drive they had, Dan.
While Johnny is laying flat on his back in the end zone after his second drive, we'll walk out and we'll hand him a game ball.
Can't give it to Andrew Hawkins. I'm just trying to think of the guys who have won it in the past. And I got one.
All right.
I got one. Joe Hayden.
Well, yeah, you have to give it to Hayden.
How about that? That's it. That's all I got.
Had a pick, had a blocked field goal.
Mm-hmm. And Sammy Watkins was one of the guys that the Browns were trying to key in on. And we were looking at the game saying, okay, well, you got to limit Sammy Watkins. Don't let him put his fingerprints all over this one. He's an impact player. He can have an impact even when he doesn't catch the ball. Sammy Watkins was basically non-existent in that game yesterday, and that's because of Joe Hayden, playing at an all-pro level again. So Joe Hayden gets my one and only game ball.
Yeah, Joe Hayden's back.
Yep.
I think we've seen that over the last few weeks. And Joe Hayden is a guy that he's not one of those corners that you just don't throw on. He's not one of those guys. I don't think he's ever been one of those guys. It seems like quarterbacks attack Joe Hayden a lot for being an elite corner, but he's a guy that can make plays like we saw yesterday. He's a guy that can shut people down. I don't know if he's a top 3 corner in the league. I don't care. He's good. And we're seeing the old Joe Hayden now. Man, if they could have gotten anything out of Justin Gilbert this season, this secondary would have been insane. Yeah. Buster Screen has done okay, but he's playing out of – he shouldn't be in the role he's in. You needed Justin Gilbert to step up and play well. And, of course, he was out yesterday with an illness. But he's kind of been out all season with poor play, to be honest. So Justin Gilbert has not done much for this team. Joe Hayden, then, more pressure on him. And I think after a rough start, he stepped up.
How about one more? I just came up with one more.
You found another one.
This is hard.
It's not Spencer Lanning, is it?
No, it's not Spencer
Lanning. I don't even think we can give one to Spencer Lanning for the first time all season.
They lose 26-10 against Buffalo, so it's really hard to find game balls. I'm going to give one to Jim Leonard.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, that's a good one.
Because I thought the minute that Buffalo got into field goal range at that point early in the game, they were just going to take their field goal and say, okay, we're going to tie this up, and we're going to make the Browns have to score more than us the rest of the way. They get into the red zone, they get inside the 10-yard line, and Kyle Orton tries to fit a ball into a really tight spot. And Jim Leonard, who took over for Tashawn Gibson, did his best to Tashawn Gibson. And I thought the Browns were going to miss Tashawn Gibson. I did. I thought that was going to be a huge area where Buffalo Bills were just going to attack. But Jim Leonard did not make me miss Tashawn Gibson, and that's saying something. I felt like he was in the right place at the right time. He was a veteran guy. He was making some calls on the defensive side of the ball. And I thought at the time that was a key interception. And I thought that was going to come back to haunt Buffalo. And then Brian gave the game away.
All right, so here's your situation. You're coming home for your last 2 home games. You've got Indianapolis and you've got Cincinnati. These 2 games scare me a little bit. Indianapolis because they're a good team. I think they're a beatable football team. I don't think they're not the Patriots.
Right.
They're not the Packers. They're not the Broncos. They're a team that you can beat on a given Sunday. They scare me, though, with that offense.
Yep.
If you struggle again offensively, they'll be up 21-0 in no time, and then you're in all kinds of trouble. And then you've got Cincinnati, as up and down team in the league as you'll find, and they're going to be coming to Cleveland looking to exact a little revenge. Now, the Browns, of course, have some bulletin board material from the last time they played, but these are 2 tough home games, and these 2 games are essentially your season. You win these 2 games, you set up that game in Carolina, and then there's a very good chance that that last game in Baltimore will mean something. But it comes down to these 2 home games now.
Yeah, it does. And unfortunately, Dan, like you, I don't have a ton of confidence. I thought if the Browns were going to stay alive in the playoff hunt, and I was going to continue to talk about them being a potential playoff team, in the previous 3-game stretch, the one that they just finished, they needed to go 2-3.
Yeah.
Or 2-1.
2-1.
In the 3 games. And they did not. They went 1-2 in those 3 games. So now you're talking about the uphill climb, because this is like the meat of the schedule. You know, when the schedule came out, we said, okay, they might be able to get on a little bit of a run here because you got Jacksonville early, you've got Tennessee early, you've got who else was early on that schedule? There was one other team, Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay, Oakland. So you thought maybe this team could go on an early run and build up enough wins where if they lose some games down the stretch because the schedule gets more difficult, maybe they can still back their way in or they can sneak in. But now they have made things so much more difficult on themselves. And I think that Buffalo loss and that one against Houston Two losses that I consider inexcusable based on the way that the other teams played to some degree and based on some certain things that the Browns had going in their favor going into those games. I think that was their season. I think their season was lost yesterday.
Yeah, and because you lost that game and because you stayed right in step with Pittsburgh, I have their schedule here. The Steelers have 2 division games left. They're both against the Bengals. Yep. If you win that game, you get ahead of Pittsburgh. You can kind of root for them to beat the Bengals. They can help you out a little bit. That's not the case now. Now those games, whoever wins those games, it hurts you. There's no edge. There's no advantage to either team winning those games. The Ravens, on the other hand, kind of looking at their schedule, they've got the Dolphins and the Texans left. Those are 2 tough-ish games. But then they also have the Jaguars, and then there's that last game of the season against the Browns.
Right.
So a big missed opportunity yesterday with Baltimore losing and Pittsburgh losing to get ahead of those teams, to give yourself a little bit of breathing room moving forward. It kills you. Losing to Buffalo, losing that game to Buffalo, a game that Buffalo tried to give you. Real quick before we go, we got about a minute. I want to get your grade on the coaching staff yesterday.
I thought it was a tale of 2 halves, actually, Dan. I thought in the first half, like you mentioned, I thought Kyle Shanahan and Mike Pettin were doing the things that they had to do against a Buffalo team. You know, Buffalo's strength was stopping the run and getting after the quarterback. So the way that you negate a team that puts a lot of pressure on the quarterback is you throw quick, and you try some screens and some misdirection and things along those lines. And I thought in the first half, Kyle Shanahan called a brilliant game. They didn't have a lot to show for it because at halftime, they had a field goal. So it's not like there was a lot of offense being scored there, but I didn't think that was because the play calling was poor. I don't have a problem with the Browns trying to get Josh Gordon involved in the game plan. A lot of people are going to say that, well, the Browns were forcing the ball to Josh Gordon. I think when you have a weapon like that, one of the most dangerous players in the NFL, I think you want to get the ball in his hands and see if he can make some plays for you. So 13 targets, it's not a problem to me. But in the second half, I did not see the Browns make any kinds of adjustments. I didn't see the Browns make a lot of double moves, trying to take advantage of Buffalo, knowing that the Browns wanted to go short. I thought there were opportunities to do that. So that's a C to me. The coaching staff gets a C. That was average.
All right, that'll do it for another edition of Morning After, a depressing edition of Morning After. The Browns losers to the Buffalo Bills, 26-10.
No Hoyer train today?
No, I think the Hoyer train has officially derailed. Joe Linta is somewhere. That's the second time I mentioned his name, trying to put the pieces back together. The Darth Vader sweater is gone. It's lost.
No, what else I hated? I hated that Brian Hoyer has been this team guy all season long, and he's always said the right things. And Johnny Manziel comes in the game, and I thought Brian Hoyer showed his true colors. I did. If you looked on that sideline, he looked deflated. He looked checked out. He wasn't supporting Johnny Manziel the way that Johnny Manziel at times was supporting him. I mean, Brian, that's not how you want a captain to react. That's not how you want one of your leaders to react. I don't think he handled him getting benched very, very well.
All right, that will do it for another edition of Morning After. He's Chris Fedor. I'm Dan Labbe. Thanks for watching.